Hi everyone, welcome to the Whiteleyverse with me, Connor Whiteley, for another daily short story. Now, before I start today's story, please remember to like, comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content, and the engagement really helps the Whiteleyverse with the YouTube algorithm. Also, if you want to buy this short story and any of my other fiction, then they're available from all major ebook retailers and at your local bookstore and local library if you requested, and you can order paperback copies from Amazon. Now, here's today's short story. I hope you enjoyed just as much as I did writing it.
The Mystery in the Student House. The 10th of January 2024. Canterbury, England. My love for you is only matched by my contempt for you now, Auntie. Private Eye Bettie English playfully hit her favorite nephew in the entire world, Sean, as they went into the awfully small white porch of the house they were secretly investigating. Betty had to admit there was clearly a reason why these houses in this part of Canterbury were so cheap. They were disgusting. Betty really didn't like the massive single panel of glass that covered 3 walls of the tiny porch, allowing out all the heat, and allowing in the icy coldness of outside inside. It was so pointless. Even the red tile flooring was ugly, but Betty supposed she couldn't complain. It wasn't like she was actually here to help her nephew check out a house. He had already graduated with his master's, but the house owners didn't need to know that. "Please take off your shoes," a woman said from inside the house. Betty rolled her eyes as the loud hammering of the rain pounded the thin tin roof above them, so much so Betty could barely hear herself think. Let alone the woman. All she wanted was a moment to warm up her hands, that were still aching and freezing from standing outside for 10 minutes in the pouring rain waiting for the woman to show up. Betty hated when people were late. Betty did as she was told, and realized maybe it wasn't the best idea to wear boots today that went halfway up her shins. She knelt down on the icy cold floor and started untying her shoes. Why this woman didn't have blue crime scene shoe covers was beyond her. That would have made it so much easier for her to do this. Betty smiled at Sean as he just slipped off his shoes and leant against the doorframe, just waiting for her. He ran a hand through his longish blonde hair with tasteful pink highlights, and he smiled at her. She knew he was just as excited about the idea of trying to find DNA evidence as she was, because Sean was a brilliant private eye in his own right. It was just a shame he preferred the tech world to the private eye world. Something she seriously wanted to change. "This way," the woman said from inside the house. Betty put her shoes to one side and went into the tiny hallway. The overwhelming aroma of garlic sweat and burnt toast hit her nose, and Betty coughed. Even when she had been at university, her and her friends had never allowed the house to smell this bad. This was something else entirely. She just wanted to find something with DNA on and get the hell out of here. She had been hired a few hours ago by a young university student, Rachel Pierce, from one of the more arty universities in Canterbury, that reported she had been assaulted and interfered with coming home last night. She had gone through all the appropriate channels and reported her attacker to the police, but Rachel couldn't prove it. So Betty had tracked down Adam Green to this house. He was out enjoying his lectures whilst Rachel was with Betty's boyfriend Graham, trying to calm down and feel safe enough to return home. Betty flat out hated seeing Rachel like that, so she was going to do everything she could to put Adam away. He needed to pay, and Betty had to find DNA to match to what Rachel had given the police last night. Betty supposed the hallway itself wasn't that bad with the tiny staircase to her left, a weird L-shaped bend that led to the living room judging by the floor plans. Betty was still so grateful to her personal assistant Fran for them, and the dark blue fluffy carpet was rather pleasant. Maybe the porch was the only bad part of the house. The pounding of the rain behind her got even louder, and Betty pretended to smile, as the realtor woman stepped into view, and Betty looked at her properly for the first time. She was rather young and pretty, which surprised Betty because she sounded rough and a little tired on the phone. Instead, the woman was tall, fit, and stood in front of her like she was a bundle of energy. Betty knew the woman clearly didn't have kids, because Betty had 2 twins, and she was never going to look like that again. But she loved her twins more than anything in the entire world.
What room are you interested in seeing first?
This is a wonderful home with so many amazing features. You and your friends are going to love it, the woman said to Sean. My name's Caroline. Then Caroline looked at Betty, like it was a little weird she was here. I'm just here because his friends have lectures and they don't trust him to look at a house alone, Betty said, grinning. Sean playfully poked his tongue out at her.
Let's see the living room first, Sean said.
Betty supposed that was a good place to start. She had to find something with DNA on. She really didn't want an attacker and potential assaulter to go free. She had to get justice for the victim. The awful aroma of burnt toast was even worse, if such a thing was possible, as Betty followed Caroline into the large rectangular living room with dark white walls, 2 very ugly orange sofas and a smart TV hanging off, not on the wall. We will obviously replace the TV before you move in, Caroline said, clearly not knowing about the damage before today. What are your thoughts? Betty subtly nodded to Sean, to signal she wanted to do some investigating, and she wanted Caroline gone for a little while. So Sean started talking about the living room, and how bad the damage was to the smart TV. Then Sean subtly walked towards the floor-to-ceiling French doors at the end of the living room, so Caroline had to have her back to Betty. Betty seriously did love her nephew, he was just brilliant. The constant pounding of the rain hitting the French door covered Betty's footsteps, as she really focused on the living room, including the 2 small wooden tables next to the sofas, and there was a small black waste bin next to them in a corner. Betty went over to it. She knelt down and managed to just about hide behind one of the ugly sofas, and she just grinned at the waste bin because it was clearly fake. The bin was simply filled with perfectly clean, not used tissues that were barely roughed up enough to even remotely pass as used. Betty just listened to Caroline cheerfully talk about the property, and then she realized that there was an edge of panic in her voice. Caroline was concerned about something, and then Betty didn't doubt the smart TV hanging off the walls wasn't concerning her. And she hadn't heard a single sound in the entire house. When her tenancy in her student house back in the late was close to ending, Betty had always made sure to be home when the new tenants came round. Mostly just because she was nosy, and wanted to check out if any of them were hot, but also to make sure they didn't mess up anything. Her friends had sadly experienced some problems back in the day, so she was determined to avoid a similar fate. There was no one else in the house though, and Betty just couldn't understand why. Sean, Betty said, standing up and folding her arms, no one lives here and Adam certainly isn't here. Caroline frowned. What? What do you mean? Who the hell are you people? Sean laughed and gestured towards Betty. So not my department. Betty took out her Private Eye ID card that also showed that she was the president of the British Private Eye Federation, a powerful organization with more power than the governments of small countries. Caroline took a few steps back. I need to contact my boss. This isn't what I wanted. I don't want to deal with you people. Betty took a few steps forward. Caroline, I'm investigating a serious assault against a young woman last night, and I need to find Adam, one of the tenants here. Where is he? Sean asked. Betty loved it how menacing and intimidating Sean was trying to look, but it seriously wasn't working. I don't know, Caroline said, taking out her phone. He was meant to be here to let me in, that's why I was late. I had to drive back to the office to get the spare keys. Betty went over to the smart TV. It had clearly been pulled off the wall, but it was at an angle with a slightly cracked screen, suggesting someone had been pushed into it and fell backwards. What about the other tenants? Betty asked. My assistant said there were 4 people living here. Caroline shook slightly, and Betty went over and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. I don't know, Caroline said. This is all a bit much. Can I just call me boss? Betty just looked at Sean. He subtly smiled at her, and Betty liked that smile, because they both knew this case was just about to get started, and that excited her a lot more than she wanted to admit even to herself. "Don't bother," Betty said. "I'll get my assistant to find your tenants and hopefully your employer can get their rent." "Thank you," Caroline said. Betty shook her head as she put her boots back on, because she couldn't believe that Caroline sounded like she was only interested in rent, and not the lives of the tenants that could be in danger, because if Betty had learnt anything over her career, it was never to underestimate how dark situations could get. Little did Betty realize just how true that idea was. Betty nodded her thanks to Fran, as she passed Betty a large mug of piping hot ground coffee as soon as she came into the living room of her house. Betty loved how the rich, intense aromas of real coffee filled the large living room, instead of the instant rubbish she had been buying lately to save money. Not because she needed to save, but it meant she could donate to charities even more. "Mummy," Elizabeth said as she charged at Betty. Betty flat out loved her little 16-month-old bundle of joy. Elizabeth was the most beautiful, precious and most amazing kid she had ever met, and Betty really did love both her kids equally. She was also rather impressed Graham had dressed Elizabeth properly today, instead of letting her run around in PJs like he normally did. Not that she could blame him because both the twins were so cute in their PJs. Betty picked up her beautiful daughter and hugged her tight, after putting the coffee mug on the large walnut coffee table in the middle of the living room. At least she didn't have to go out in that awful rain that was still hammering outside. Then Betty nodded at the 3 massive whiteboards Fran had thankfully put up, whilst Betty had driven over here. The whiteboards were pushed against the far wall of the room, so she couldn't see the TV, but that didn't matter. She was here to solve a crime, not watch TV. The whiteboard to the left was covered in notes about Rachel and the attack last night, using everything they had gotten from the police report, Rachel herself and any other evidence they could find. Betty had to admit she would have liked a lot more detail on that particular board, but this was a tough one. They only knew Rachel was attacked in an alley by Adam, and then she had managed to run to the police station before breaking down, crying and succumbing to shock. Thankfully, she had managed to give her statement first. Betty was really impressed with how brave, amazing, and courageous Rachel had been. She doubted she could hold off shock and crying that much. "I can't actually find that much on the other tenants," Fran said, sitting down on one of Betty's 2 massive sofas. Betty smiled as Sean and his wonderful boyfriend Harry came down the stairs, holding hands before sitting on another sofa. Having her wonderful family here made Betty a lot more excited than she had any right to feel, because now she knew, truly knew they were going to find Adam and the other tenants. Together her and her family and friends were unstoppable. "I could only find references and odd social media posts about the other tenants. Joshua, Nathan and Ethan all lived in that house yesterday," Fran said. "But today, no one has seen them." "Doorbell footage?" Betty asked, bouncing Elizabeth a little in her arms. "Nothing," Harry said. Betty rolled her eyes. If there was doorbell footage of the tenants, then Harry would have found it, so Betty had no reason to doubt it. It was just annoying as hell. These tenants looked like they had simply disappeared. "Auntie, why would the tenants leave?" Betty smiled. "What connections are there between Rachel and Adam and the other tenants? I know they all go to the same university, and Rachel and Adam had seen each other at clubs and bars before." "That's it," Fran said, shrugging. "My initial and secondary searches all reveal there are no other connections. No classes, no social groups, and nothing else that links Rachel to Adam or anyone else." "How did she know his name?" Harry asked. Betty smiled as everyone went deadly silent, and she just let the question hang in the air between them all. That was a brilliant question, and she wished she had thought of it herself because it was stupidly true. Fran was an amazing computer person and personal assistant, and Betty believed her when Fran said the searches came up blank. Betty had little doubt Harry had done a computer deep dive on Adam, Rachel, and the tenants, because he was sensational with computers. All the searches had come up blank, so why did Rachel know Adam's name? And why was she able to identify him as her attacker? Betty gestured Sean to come with her, and then Betty gave Elizabeth a little kiss on the cheek before giving her to Harry. Then Betty and Sean went upstairs into Sean's and Harry's bedroom, where the subtle aromas of lavender, lilacs and roses filled the large bedroom, from a little romantic gesture from Harry to Sean yesterday. Betty smiled at how clean, tidy and filled with great personal items like holiday photos and romantic gifts covered all the walls and cabinets. It was why she had wanted Rachel to be in here today, because it was such a happy room, filled with love, protection and devotion between lovers. It was a safe place. "Hi," Graham said in his tight sexy jeans and tight black hoodie. Betty was so taking that off later on, where Rachel was playing with Harrison. Betty had to admit it was great seeing Rachel smiling, laughing and with a little more color back in her face. Betty had hated seeing Rachel this morning with cuts, bruises and extreme fear on her face. She didn't even want to question Rachel now, but she was going to have to, the case might depend on it. "Harrison," Betty said as joyfully as she could, "can you show Sean where the ice lollies are, please? He's forgotten again." Cute little Harrison sat up immediately, and started wiggling towards the end of Sean's bed, before jumping off with so much energy Betty was almost scared.
"Sean's so silly, isn't he, Mummy?"
Harrison asked.
"Yes, he is, sweetie."
Betty laughed as Harrison just gently took Sean's hand in his, and he led Sean back down up. "Mummy," Harrison shouted, "can I have one if I do this?"
"Yes, sweetie, and make sure your sister gets one."
"Okay. Thank you, Mummy." Betty laughed and Graham just shook his head at her. Then Betty frowned a little, as she went over to Rachel, and sat on the opposite end of the bed to her. "Rachel, I need to ask you a simple question, is that okay?" Betty asked. Rachel looked at the floor. "I've already told Graham everything I know." "I know, but it's important," Betty said, knowing Graham had been trained to talk to assault victims, so if she had said anything major then he would have told her by now.
"Please," Graham said.
"Betty is an amazing woman and she will help you, but remember, like I said, you need to trust us." Rachel nodded, so Betty weakly smiled at Rachel.
"How do you know Adam?"
"We can't find any record or evidence of you knowing each other. He never spoke to you at the bar. You don't share classes, social groups or anything." Rachel looked up at Betty. "You calling me a liar?" "No," Betty said, shaking her head. "I'm just curious, and a defense barrister will be a lot harsher than me when this goes to trial." Rachel laid down on the bed, and buried her face in the pillows. Betty wanted to move closer and gently hold Rachel's hand, but she didn't dare, and she couldn't help but feel that something was off.
"I met him once," Rachel said. "It was first year, so 2 years ago, there was a rave near the River Medway."
"No phones, no tech and no cameras." Betty nodded. She had heard about the rave because the police had broken it up, and it was on a small seafort island in the River Medway near Upner and Hoo Marina. It had been a massive rave, and no one could exactly figure out how over 100 young people had gotten on the island in the first place. But after the drugs were found, high-price lawyers for the rich kids had brought down their power on the police and whatnot. No one had ever thought about it again. "I was swinging from one of the rope swings, and Adam started chatting to me. He was nice, sweet, and we exchanged names and whatnot," Rachel said.
"Then he tried to kiss me, and I said no."
"He wasn't happy." Betty nodded at Graham.
"Then I saw him last night for the first time since the rave.
He was happy to see me and I tried to get away from him, but it didn't work out, did it?" Betty got off the bed and paced around a little. At least that was the connection, and why Rachel was able to identify the attacker, but there were still more questions. Thankfully, she only needed to ask Rachel one more. "Joshua, Nathan and Ethan, they live with Adam," Betty said. "I need to know, would any of them fight Adam to protect you?" Rachel sat up on the bed and smiled. "Ethan would, bless him, he was so cute. Adam hated him for being a trans man, but no one else cares. He was so cute, so sweet and so perfect." Betty smiled. It was great to know how much she cared about Ethan, and that explained a lot about what had happened last night. Final question, Betty said. I'm guessing you and Ethan met at the rave and you haven't spoken since. I wanted to get his phone number that night, but Adam was so focused on me I just couldn't. I didn't even realize he was trying to control me that night, Rachel said, then she threw her head back and accidentally hit the headboard. Betty nodded, because things were finally starting to make perfect sense. She didn't doubt for a moment that after the attack, Adam had gone home to his housemates, bragged about the attack, then Ethan would have been outraged. Then Betty completely understood if Ethan was angry enough to start a fight, and him or Adam or maybe one of the others had been pushed into the smart TV, causing the damage. It was only what happened next Betty didn't understand yet. Why stage the property to look like it was being lived in, when it clearly wasn't? Why not just run instead of preparing the scene like the waste bin? It made no sense. Betty took out her phone and called the Federation. She was going to need a helicopter. She had to get to the sea fort immediately. She didn't know how, but she just knew Adam and the others would be there. And Betty was going to get the truth out of Adam, no matter what. Betty flat out loved the power, resources and all the good vehicles the Federation had access to, as she waved the massive black helicopter away after it had carefully dropped her off next to Fort Darrett in the River Medway via rope winch. The soft wild grass was soft and rather warm for a change under Betty's feet, and she was so glad the damn rain had stopped about 2 hours ago, so her boots weren't getting wet. The very last thing she wanted was to be stuck on an island when it was wet and cold and just draining. The fort itself was rather impressive, with it being a massive ring of concrete and bricks, going up one story with a flat roof. Yet because the fort had been designed for 11 guns, there were 11 flat sides to the ring with wide openings to shoot through. Even though the fort never saw any action, Betty was glad it was in such good condition, considering it had finished being built in 1872, as part of plans for the defences of Chatham Dockyard, where England had kept most of its naval power in the 1800s. Betty just couldn't help but smile at the old fort because she wanted to know what the fort could have been, if the original ideas for 2 tiers had been completed. The cost of the project had caused it to be finished in 1872, and it was impressive enough, but Betty would have liked to know what it could have been. The rich aromas of sea salt, smoke and cooked meat filled the air, as Betty went over to the small hole in a massive rusty sheet of metal that had been placed over each gun opening. Betty could hear muttered voices, and she really hoped that Graham, Sean and Fran could convince Kent Police to bring officers here as soon as possible. She was about to climb inside, when she noticed the wide moat around the fort that dropped down into thick, sloppy mud below with steep sides on either side. The only way to get to the fort was by climbing over a thick wooden beam, and even that was only accessible after coming through a narrow opening through a thick bush of thorns that ran around the edge of the entire moat. If Betty got into trouble here, then she was completely alone. Betty climbed inside and was surprised at the sheer grey stone curved walls of the fort that went round in a ring. There was so much stuff on the ground like dust, sand and dirt, that it was like nature was determined more than ever to reclaim the island. Then she saw them. In the middle of the fort, there was another moat that Betty knew from her childhood, dropped down tens upon tens of meters to flooded storage rooms. But after the drop down, there was a large brick platform covered in bushes and trees, and the people she was searching for were there. Betty recognized Adam immediately with his black crew cut, black eye and almost too thin body. Then there were 2 other young men she couldn't really tell, apart with brown hair and matching black clothes. They had to be Joshua and Nathan. But it was Ethan that Betty was more concerned about. The young man with longish blonde hair was holding his left arm like he had been stabbed, and his once blue hoodie was now a lot darker, and Betty just hated Adam more than ever. Betty went over to the edge of the moat, and she was right next to a narrow brick walkway that led onto the central platform where the others were. "Who the hell are you?" Adam asked, clearly annoyed.
"She's Betty English," Ethan said, a little starstruck.
"You know, the woman in the papers and the woman on the news. You're in shit now, Adam." Betty laughed because hopefully Ethan was right. "You attacked Rachel last night. you committed criminal damage in your house and I'm sure this is private property. How did you even get here? Everyone looked at Betty like she was the dumbest woman alive. There's a guy in Who Marina, Adam said. You pay him and he brings you after dark. Betty nodded and kicked some of the dust under her feet. At least that explained how all the students got here for the rave 2 years ago, and how the 4 of them had gotten here after the attack.
What happened at the house?
Betty asked, wanting to buy the police as much time as possible. Adam pulled out a knife that was still dripping blood.
It don't matter, Adam said. None of this matters.
Just leave us alone and go away. I can't do that, Adam, and you know it. You attacked an innocent woman. Betty went onto the brick walkway, and hated how a massive brick splashed into the water below. She wasn't sure how long this walkway would hold, but she wasn't going to show Adam she was scared. Adam grabbed Ethan's injured arm and pressed the knife against his throat.
This is all your fault, you bitch.
Why don't you just admit you like Rachel?
But we both know she won't like a pussy girl like you.
You aren't even a real man. Betty just glared at Adam. That was enough, and she was going to make Adam pay for everything now. Betty took another step forward, and 2 massive bricks splashed into the water below. She went to get onto the platform, but Joshua and Nathan picked up 2 broken bricks each, and gestured they were going to throw them at Betty. Betty seriously wasn't sure if she could dodge all 4 bricks, without falling into the stagnant water below. She hated to imagine what disease or infection she would pick up from that water. Adam jabbed the knife a little harder against Ethan's throat, and Betty hated seeing how defeated Ethan looked.
She likes you a lot, Ethan, Betty said.
She doesn't care that you're a trans man and you are a man to her, and me for what it's worth. People like Adam don't matter. Ethan looked into Betty's eyes. Really?
Her face lit up when she spoke about you, Betty said.
Police sirens echoed around the fort from the distance. Ethan stomped on Adam's feet. Adam let go. He was about to swing. Betty charged forward. The walkway collapsed. Betty screamed. She fell. She gripped onto the edge of the central platform as the bricks splashed down below. Betty kicked against the wall, but she couldn't get a grip. Thunder roared overhead and rain started slashing down. The edge of the platform was getting wetter and wetter. Betty didn't know how much longer she could hold onto it.
Leave her, Adam shouted.
Betty tried to pull herself up as much as she could, but she couldn't. Her hands burnt. Her muscles ached. Pain flooded her arms. She was about to let go. Betty shouted for help. No one came. She was alone. She was going to fall. She fell. 2 hands gripped her arm. Betty slammed into the brick wall as someone pulled her up. As soon as she felt the solid central platform under her, she leapt up and hugged Ethan. Then she broke the hug and listened for the police sirens. They were coming from the south side of the island, and no other direction.
The man gave us a crappy little speedboat on the north side of the island, Ethan said. Is that important?
Betty nodded, and she ran and jumped over the moat she had just almost died from. She rushed over to the nearest gun opening and climbed outside. Ethan followed her. Betty started running towards the thick wooden beam. Of course it's important. Even a crappy speedboat with a 2-stroke engine would let them get to the mainland. Betty went running, and she went quickly and carefully as she got over the wooden beam that moaned and groaned as she went over it. Betty hissed in pain, as the sharp thorns caught her as she raced through the narrow opening. The awfully soft ground was almost trying to slow her down, but Betty wasn't stopping for anything or anyone. As soon as she got through the thorn bushes, she saw Adam, Nathan and Joshua on the other side of a large area of cordgrass. They were climbing into a small black speedboat that barely looked seaworthy. They were going to die if they went out in that. Betty couldn't allow that to happen. Betty ran as fast as she could. The thick aroma of sea salt was almost choking, but she kept running. Icy cold breeze slammed against her, but Betty just kept running. Ethan ran behind her, but Betty was faster. Betty could barely hear the police sirens of the police boats as Adam pushed the boat into the water. Just as Joshua and Nathan were about to climb in, Adam pushed them out. Joshua and Nathan slipped on the mud and accidentally pushed the boat out into the raging River Medway. The rain lashed down even harder, and Adam activated the engine. The speedboat roared to life. Betty ran as fast as she could. But Adam just started to speed away. A massive gust of icy wind made Betty jump and created massive waves in the river. One slammed into the speedboat, flipping it over. Betty didn't think. She only acted. She charged into the River Medway and swam towards Adam. She wasn't letting him drown. He had to answer for his crimes. A few hours later, when the awful rain had finally stopped, Betty wrapped a wonderfully thick white blanket round herself as she sat on her sofa facing the TV in her living room. When she had gotten home from the hospital where she had been treated for hypothermia, given God knows how many statements to the police, and been slightly told off by Graham for swimming into icy cold water during a storm, she had felt like the house was a little empty. The 3 massive whiteboards were gone, Fran had gone home for the night, and even Sean and Harry had gone out with some friends tonight. They had tried to paint it as a crazy night on the town, but Betty knew it was code for just talking, laughing and enjoying themselves at a local pub. Betty had put the twins to bed earlier, and she was just enjoying the silence of the house after a wonderfully hectic day. So Betty allowed the softness of the sofa to claim her weight, and she was so looking forward to what was going to happen next. Especially with the delicious rich aromas of basil, garlic and cheese, coming from the kitchen where Graham was finishing up one of his famous meals for her. Sometimes that meant great food from recipes from mainland Europe, or sometimes it meant disgusting creations of his own, but Betty loved him no matter what. She was just hoping beyond hope it would be the first option. After she had swam into the River Medway, getting colder and colder with each passing second, she had managed to grab Adam despite his shock and dragged him back to the island Fort Darnett was on. Then she had handed them all over to Graham and the police, and they had gone to hospital to be checked out. Betty was glad she had only needed to be warmed up with more tea, not coffee sadly, than she wanted to admit. She so wasn't drinking English tea after that hospital trip, it was disgusting. At least Adam had confessed, and DNA confirmed, to seeing Rachel at the party last night. Then he had followed her on her way home, and when she had taken a shortcut down an alley, he had attacked her. Betty had almost vomited during his graphic account of the attack. She never wanted him to see the light of day ever again. Then Adam had gone home after kicking Rachel in the stomach to see his housemates. He had bragged about it because it made him feel powerful and manly, so Ethan had flipped out at him for attacking an innocent woman. Especially a woman that had been so kind to him. They had fought, and Ethan had been pushed into the smart TV, making it hang off the wall. So Joshua and Nathan, being Adam's good little pets, had sided with Adam, and made Ethan help with the staging of the house. The idea behind that had been to give them a day to decide what to do with Ethan, and where they were going to run away to. They knew Rachel was going to talk, so their time was limited. Betty was still surprised they had gone to the fort, but considering that was where all of this had started 2 years ago, it sort of made sense, and Betty probably would have done the same if she was them. Once at the fort, Adam had started a small fire to keep them warm, and Ethan had tried to get Adam to turn himself in. Adam had slashed Ethan's arm to make him shut up. Then Betty arrived, and judging by the sheer look of anger on Adam's face at the hospital when Ethan had walked past his bed, she didn't doubt Ethan would have been dead if she hadn't arrived. Betty was more than glad she had. Especially because Rachel had gone to the hospital to see Ethan, and they had spoken, kissed, and they had agreed to go on a date. Betty couldn't stop smiling as the man she loved came into the living room without any food and a massive guilty grin on his face. He might have been a rubbish chef, but she loved him more than anything else in the entire world.
Let me guess, Betty said, takeaway and sex tonight?
You read my mind. Betty threw the blanket at Graham, as they laughed and kissed and made out like two horny teenagers. And after the hecticness of today, Betty was more than looking forward to all the fun she was going to have tonight, and all the nights after that.
Welcome back everyone, it's me again, Connor Whiteley. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's story, because I flat out love writing, creating stories and sharing them with you. If you really enjoyed today's story, then please remember to like, comment and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content, and the engagement really helps the Whiteleyverse with the YouTube algorithms. And if you want to buy this short story or any of my other fiction, then they're available from all major ebook retailers, and you can get them from your local library if you requested, and you can order the paperback copies from Amazon, your local bookstore or local library if you request it. Lastly, if you want to support the channel on a one-off basis, then you can now buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Connor Whiteley. Also, if you know anyone who would enjoy today's story, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the word about the channel. So, thanks for watching the Whiteleyverse, and I'll see you again soon. Have a great day, everyone.